The night was so dark, it felt like the world had been switched off. In the middle of a field in occupied France, a man bent over the railway tracks, trying with trembling fingers to fasten a small explosive charge. In the distance, the metallic sound of an approaching train. His breathing was fast. He knew that a single wrong move could mean dying right there, not as a soldier, but as a terrorist, as the Nazis called anyone who dared resist. The train was carrying ammunition and equipment to the front. If the explosion worked, hundreds of German soldiers would be left without supplies. If it failed, he wouldn't live to see dawn. Silently, he pressed the improvised detonator and disappeared into the darkness. Behind actions like this, seemingly small, there spread a network of men and women who decided to confront the Third Reich with whatever weapons they had: dynamite, invisible ink, clandestine typewriters, and a courage that never appeared on any military map. They were the silent saboteurs. When Hitler's armies swept across Europe between 1939 and 1941, the map of the continent changed at brutal speed. Poland fell in a few weeks. France surrendered in 1940. Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, Greece, one after another, the colors of the Reich advanced across the Atlas. For many it looked like the end. Swastika flags flew over historic buildings. Radios broadcast Nazi speeches in translation. Newspapers were censored. But beneath that surface of total control, something started to move. According to historical records, almost every occupied country had some kind of resistance movement, from Poland to Norway, from France to Yugoslavia, from the Netherlands to Greece. Some groups were communist, others monarchist, others nationalist. Many disagreed among themselves, but converged on one point: sabotage the German war machine in any way possible. Sabotage here meant many things: blowing up tracks, delaying trains, stealing documents, forging identities, hiding downed airmen, transmitting intelligence. In many cases, the bullet was the last resort. Before that came silence, cunning and patience. Meanwhile in London, a British politician pointed at a map of Europe and made a request that sounded almost desperate: set the continent on fire. In 1940, with France defeated and the United Kingdom practically alone against the Reich, Winston Churchill understood that it wasn't enough to resist in the skies with the RAF or at sea. It was necessary to open wounds inside occupied Europe. So the Special Operations Executive SOE was created, a secret British organization with a mission as simple as it was dangerous: to support, organize, and expand resistance in occupied territories. According to British records, Churchill's order to the SOE was clear and brutal: set Europe ablaze. The SOE began training agents in infiltration, sabotage, and clandestine communications. Men and women were taken to secret training camps in Scotland and other remote regions. There they learned how to use demolition explosives on tracks, bridges, and factories, assemble clandestine radios and transmit coded messages, produce forged documents, kill silently, if it came to that. But the main point wasn't the British agents themselves. They would often act as instructors, catalysts. The ones who would truly set Europe ablaze were the occupied Europeans: railway workers, students, peasants, priests, factory hands. Meanwhile, the Germans believed they had imposed an iron order. In practice, small cracks were starting to appear in that control, cracks that would over time grow into deep fractures. To understand European resistance, it's impossible to ignore Poland, the first major laboratory of Nazi occupation. Invaded in September 1939 and carved up between Germany and the Soviet Union, Poland saw its state destroyed on paper, but not in practice. According to historical records, Polish politicians, officers, and intellectuals began organizing what became known as the underground state. It included a clandestine administration, a parallel justice system, secret schools to bypass the ban on higher education, and of course, illegal armed forces. The main military resistance organization became the Armia Krajowa, AK, the Home Army. Not all AK actions were direct sabotage, but many were. Typical scenes from Poland's silent war included railway tracks being quietly damaged to cause accidental derailments, fuel depots going up in flames in the middle of the night, telephone lines cut on the eve of German operations, and above all, systematic gathering of military information on troop movements and secret installations. One of the most remarkable achievements of the Polish resistance, according to several studies, was sending detailed intelligence on the Peenemünde complex, where the Germans were developing V-2 rockets. Data collected by Polish agents helped the RAF bomb the site in 1943, delaying Hitler's vengeance weapon program. At the same time, Poland became the stage for one of the bravest forms of resistance, attempts to warn the world about the mass extermination of Jews. Figures like Jan Karski, a courier for the resistance, crossed Europe to tell what they had seen. Sabotage there was no longer just against tracks, but against the killing machine itself. No one knew then how much this underground network would inspire other occupied peoples. The fall of France in June 1940 shocked the world. The image of German soldiers marching through Paris seemed the perfect symbol of a defeated continent. But in the shadows of narrow streets, another story was beginning. At first, the French resistance was fragmented. There were Gaullist groups answering the calls of General Charles de Gaulle in London, communist networks which became more active, especially after 1941 when Germany invaded the Soviet Union, Christian monarchist and nationalist circles. The word resistance took shape gradually. Many of the first acts were symbolic, clandestine leaflets, underground newspapers, graffiti against the Vichy collaborationist regime, protection for persecuted Jews. But as the war dragged on, sabotage moved to the center. According to French and Allied records, between 1942 and 1944, the Maquis, guerrilla groups operating in rural and mountainous areas, stepped up attacks on railway tracks to delay German troop movements, telegraph and telephone lines, fuel depots, and in some cases, isolated soldiers and officers. Many Maquisards were young people who had fled the compulsory labor service imposed by the Germans. They lived in makeshift camps in forests, slept in caves, and survived on whatever they could obtain from sympathetic peasants. At the same time, SOE agents began parachuting into France, bringing explosives, light weapons and radios. One figure stands out in the process of unification, Jean Moulin, sent by de Gaulle. He worked to bring the various resistance networks under a more centralized coordination, the Conseil National de la Résistance CNR. His work was brutally interrupted when he was captured by the Gestapo, tortured and killed. Even so, the structure he helped build kept functioning. Meanwhile, German trains kept running, but more slowly. In the run-up to D-Day in June 1944, sabotage reached a critical level. According to studies of the Normandy campaign, Allied orders were sent for the Maquis to intensify destruction of railways, bridges, and lines of communication behind German lines. The objective was clear: make it harder to send reinforcements to the Normandy beaches. On many nights that year, small explosions echoed in valleys, tunnels, and bridges. These were not just random bangs, they were deliberate blows to the circulatory system of the Wehrmacht. Sabotage was not just about destruction, it was also about harassment, attrition, and demoralization. A blown-up rail line could be repaired, a cut telephone cable could be reconnected. But what did that do to the mind of a German officer in charge of a region, and to the morale of his soldiers? Imagine a Wehrmacht commander in a small French or Polish town.
He keeps receiving reports. Train derailed last night. Communications cable cut for the third time in 2 weeks. Railway signs switched, causing routing confusion. Coal mixed with substances damaging locomotive boilers. Each incident on its own could be treated as minor sabotage, but together they became a constant noise, a daily reminder that they did not fully control that territory. German documents from the time show that repression measures escalated as sabotage grew: public executions, deportations, village burnings. The regime believed terror would prevent further actions. In many places the opposite happened. Each reprisal fed the anger of entire populations. Sabotage took on not only a military meaning, but a moral one. Meanwhile, farther north, in a country of mountains and fjords, a group of Norwegians trained by the British prepared an operation so delicate it sounds like fiction, but which, according to most historians, had real impact on one of the Reich's most dangerous weapons in development. Norway had been occupied by Germany in 1940. Its strategic position, with a long coastline facing the North Atlantic, was valuable for German submarines and ships. But in the mountainous interior, there was something even more sensitive: a heavy water plant at Vemork, near the town of Rijekaan. Heavy water is water in which ordinary hydrogen is partially replaced by deuterium. Without getting lost in technicalities, it can be used as a moderator in certain types of nuclear reactors. According to historical records, Allied intelligence came to believe that the German nuclear program might depend in part on supplies from this plant. If that were true, and many Allied scientists considered it a serious possibility, then this small Norwegian plant became a crucial target. Sabotaging Vemork could delay, or even derail, a possible Hitler atomic bomb. The problem: the plant sat on an isolated plateau, ringed by cliffs, snow and ice. It was defended by German troops and watched closely. A direct assault would be suicide. So one of the most daring sabotage missions of the Second World War was born. Before the famous successful operation, there was an almost forgotten failure. In 1942, the British planned Operation Freshman. Commandos would be towed in gliders to land near the plant, attack the facility, and destroy it with explosives. The plan mixed courage with perhaps too much optimism about the terrain and weather. On the night of the raid, bad weather, navigation problems, and technical issues combined tragically. One tug plane and its glider crashed into a mountain. Another pair was forced to land far from the target. Survivors were captured by German forces. Later records show that prisoners from this operation were executed, some under Hitler's notorious Kommando Befehl, which ordered summary execution of captured commandos. Freshmen never got close to the plant. It was a brutal lesson, but instead of abandoning the idea, the British and Norwegians decided to try again, this time with a smaller, lighter group, better adapted to the terrain. Meanwhile, a small team of Norwegian saboteurs had already spent months in the frozen wilderness waiting for a second chance. Operation Gunnersight, launched in 1943, brought together the SOE and Norwegian commandos. The main group consisted of Norwegians in exile, trained in the United Kingdom in sabotage skiing and extreme climate survival. A reconnaissance team sent earlier had already parachuted into the region and nearly starved to death while waiting for Freshman's outcome. With the first mission's failure, they had to survive for weeks in the mountains, living off reindeer and whatever else they could find while dodging German patrols. When Gunnersight was finally approved, another team of Norwegian commandos joined the original group. They flew to Norway, jumped into a freezing night, and after linking up with the others, spent days skiing across hostile terrain to reach the Vemork area. Every step carried huge risk of avalanches, risk of being spotted by locals under German control, risk of patrols, risk of simply freezing to death. But they kept going. In post-war testimony, one commando remembered the sound of snow under their skis, breaking the absolute silence of the night. There were no horns, no city noise, no visible civilization, only wind and rock. Eventually they saw the Vemork complex. The plant rose lit up in the frozen valley, connected to the rest of the world by a narrow bridge over a deep gorge. It was obvious the Germans expected an attack there. The main access was heavily guarded, so the Norwegian saboteurs decided to do the improbable: descend into the gorge, cross the frozen river below, and climb the opposite cliff, all while carrying packs full of explosives. Any slip meant a fatal fall, and even if they reached the top, they would still have to get into the plant, avoid guards, set the charges, and escape. This was sabotage pushed to the physical limit. On the night of the operation, the group, now split into teams, carried out the plan. They descended carefully into the gorge, using ropes and local knowledge. The river roared below, freezing and unforgiving. They crossed it and began the climb up the other side, clinging to ice-covered rocks. Reaching the top, they approached the plant from a less expected angle. The rear, they managed to enter through a power cable route or service area, depending on the source, avoiding the main gate. Inside, the scene changed completely. Artificial light, pipes and valves, the smell of oil and steam. Men covered in snow and sweat moved like shadows through an industrial maze. Their main target was the room with the electrolytic cells, the heart of heavy water production. They knew this was not just another target, it was potentially a key piece in the nuclear puzzle. According to Norwegian records, the saboteurs overpowered a local worker, quietly explained they didn't want to hurt him, and told him to stay silent. Then they began placing plastic explosives supplied by the British on critical parts of the installation. It was painstaking work, almost surgical. Charges were fixed with tape, wires and timers. Any miscalculation could mean an explosion too weak to matter, or their own instant deaths. Years later, one of the commandos recalled looking at his watch, seeing the minutes tick away, and feeling something that was not exactly fear, but a kind of complete clarity. If they failed, Germany would go on producing heavy water with little disruption. If they succeeded, they might have altered the course of an entire technology. They set the charges, started the timers, and pulled back. Moments later, an explosion shook the Vemork night. Tactically, the sabotage was a success. Heavy water production at Vemork was badly damaged. According to historical record, it took the Germans considerable time to restore full operations, and even then, they remained under constant threat. More important still, the episode proved that the resistance, supported in this case by special operations, could hit an extremely sensitive target at the core of a strategic German program. The saboteurs got away, some crossing the mountains back into Sweden, others hiding inside Norway. German propaganda tried to play down the impact, but in reality, their confidence in the safety of critical facilities had been shattered. Later, in 1944, another Norwegian sabotage hit the same problem from a different angle: the sinking of the ferry SF Hydro, which was carrying heavy water and equipment across Lake Tinshoe. The ship was blown up with explosives planted by the resistance, killing civilians and soldiers on board, but also destroying the valuable cargo. It's impossible to measure precisely how much these actions delayed or complicated a potential German nuclear program. Historians still debate how close the Reich actually came to an atomic weapon, but according to many researchers, the combined effect of these sabotages significantly increased the obstacle. In wartime, any delay counts. Meanwhile, in other parts of Europe, resistance movements were facing different challenges with the same logic: hit the enemy where he least expected, with improvised weapons and courage far bigger than the size of the explosions. It was the same war, spoken with different accents: Greek peasants blowing up bridges in Mediterranean valleys, Dutch railway workers delaying trains heading east, Yugoslav partisans sabotaging German supply lines in pine-covered mountains. And in each of those places, the question was the same: how far can you push the secret war before the occupier decides to punish an entire population? It is on that moral and strategic frontier that our story now dives deeper, when the silent saboteurs stop being just isolated figures and become entire movements, capable of shaking not only tracks and factories, but the Nazi certainty that occupied Europe was safely under control. That night, in a Balkan village, the silence was broken not by German tanks, but by a smaller sound, a metallic click, the crackle of a fuse, the tense hum of wires being cut. Minutes later, a freight train loaded with fuel and ammunition would take that curve. What no one inside the wagons could see were the missing bolts, the small lump of explosive hidden under the rail, the discreetly reversed signpost turned by anonymous hands. When the train entered the bend, the whole war seemed to jump off the tracks for a moment. It was just one more accident in German reports, but taken together, those accidents had a name: resistance. Occupied Greece lived under a triple presence: Germans, Italians, and Bulgarians. Hunger, reprisals, and persecution were part of daily life, but the Greek mountains, long the setting of ancient myths, now became the stage of fierce resistance. Two large groups dominated the armed struggle: ELS, with a leftist communist orientation, and EDS, more monarchist and nationalist. They disagreed deeply about Greece's political future, but with British encouragement, they sometimes managed to cooperate against their common enemy.
One of those moments marked history: the attack on the Gorgopotamus Bridge in November 1942. According to historical records, this railway bridge was vital to the supply line linking Greece to North Africa, along which cargo flowed to Axis forces under Rommel. The British SOE, alongside Greek guerrillas, planned an operation known as Harling. The plan was simple and suicidal at the same time: infiltrate a small group of British commandos into the mountains, approach the bridge, coordinate with local forces, and place explosive charges on its pillars under the nose of German and Italian troops. The night of the attack seemed to cooperate: darkness, wind, only the sound of the river in the valley. Greek guerrillas took up positions to cover the approach. British commandos, carrying plastic explosives, crawled toward the base of the bridge. The fight was short, intense, and chaotic. Gunfire and shouted orders in Greek, Italian, and German mixed together. Amid the confusion, the charges were placed and armed. Soon after, an explosion split the night. Part of the bridge collapsed in a burst of sparks and twisted metal. For the Germans, it would be recorded as sabotage by hostile elements. For the resistance, it meant something else: proof that even in a starving, brutally occupied country, it was still possible to strike directly at the Axis strategic infrastructure. Meanwhile, in Greek villages, consequences approached with heavy boots. Occupation forces answered with severe reprisals, executions, arrests, house burnings. The message was clear: every destroyed bridge would be paid for in civilian lives. Even so, the resistance had passed a point of no return. Each Nazi act of terror pushed more young people into the mountains, feeding the invisible war on tracks, cables, and depots. In few regions of occupied Europe did armed resistance reach the scale it did in Yugoslavia. There, sabotage and guerrilla warfare blended until they were nearly an open war, fragmented into different peoples and identities: Serbs, Croats, Slovenes, Bosnians, and others. Yugoslavia saw several armed groups emerge, often with conflicting goals, but one stood out for the reach of its operations: the partisans led by Josip Broz Tito. At first, they were just small bands attacking convoys, cutting phone lines, ambushing patrols, but according to historical records, throughout 1942 and 1943, the partisans grew in numbers and organization, establishing liberated zones in mountains and forests. Sabotage was one of their main weapons: explosions on railways, especially on the vital route connecting Germany and Italy to Greece, and the Eastern Front attacks on bridges and tunnels, destruction of fuel and supply depots. Tito and his commanders knew they couldn't defeat the Wehrmacht in continuous frontal battles, but they could wear it down, forcing it to spread troops thin, burn fuel, and waste time. Some post-war military studies argue that efforts to fight the partisans in the Balkans tied down a significant number of German and Axis units, forces that might otherwise have been used on the Eastern Front or in Germany's own defense. In the cities, resistance informants noted locomotive numbers, train lengths, directions of travel. These data, sent via clandestine radios, ended up on Allied analysts' desks, helping build a more accurate picture of Reich logistics. But German and collaborator brutality also escalated. Entire villages were wiped out, populations used as shields or executed in reprisal. The line between resistance and civil war, especially in Yugoslavia, became dangerously blurred. Even so, for many guerrillas, blowing up tracks and depots was more than strategy. It was the only way they could imagine, refusing the role of spectator in a war that had invaded their homes. In occupied Holland, the scene looked calm at first glance: orderly cities, clean streets, bike paths, canals. But in the quiet of narrow houses and office back rooms, another kind of sabotage took form: sabotage by bureaucracy. Dutch railways were crucial for German transport. According to historical records, railway workers began to delay trains discreetly, create technical problems, misroute wagons, and slow down maintenance. In 1944, as the Allies advanced after Normandy, tensions peaked. Following a call from the Dutch government in exile, many workers joined the 1944 railway strike. The stoppage seriously undermined Germany's ability to move troops and supplies, but carried a terrible price: reprisals and the worsening of famine in several cities. During the hunger winter of 1944-45, sabotage there was a double-edged sword. Beyond the railways, there was another front: civil records. Nazis and collaborators relied on population registers to identify Jews, trace men of working age, and control movement. In the Netherlands and Belgium, resistance groups organized attacks on registry offices and archives. Fires destroyed files, lists, address records. In some cases, clandestine teams first separated documents belonging to people they wanted to save, making sure those files would disappear before the burning. At the same time, escape lines such as the Comet Line in Belgium helped downed Allied airmen get out of occupied Europe, guiding them through France to Spain along a clandestine human route. Each pilot who made it back to England brought valuable information on anti-aircraft defenses and conditions behind enemy lines. Again, sabotage was understood in a broad sense, not just blowing things up, but denying the Reich full control over people and information. Meanwhile, a small kingdom in Northern Europe showed that resistance could also mean sabotaging political decisions and even playing on the conscience of the merchant navy. Denmark was in some ways a special case. Occupied in 1940, it initially kept a collaborationist government with a certain degree of autonomy. For the first years, many Danes lived under the dangerous illusion of a soft occupation. That illusion didn't last. Over time, German pressure increased, especially regarding the persecution of Jews and the use of Danish resources in the war effort. According to historical records, the Danish resistance movement began timidly, with clandestine newspapers and small acts of sabotage in factories producing for Germany. Machines were mysteriously damaged, parts came out faulty, ships built for the Reich showed inexplicable structural problems. From 1943 on, as the occupation hardened, resistance grew more active. Industrial and railway sabotage surged. A particular form of sabotage gained weight: moral sabotage, as much of society refused to cooperate in what it saw as unacceptable. The most striking example was the Operation, unarmed but extremely risky, to save the country's Jewish community. When Danes learned that the Germans were preparing mass arrests, they organized, almost spontaneously, an effort to ferry thousands of Jews in fishing boats to neutral Sweden. No explosions, no tracks ripped up, but in practice, the Danes sabotaged a core Nazi project to exterminate all Jews wherever the Reich had power. Meanwhile, deep inside the German Empire,
A small group of students tried to sabotage not factories, but something even harder to hit, fear itself. In Germany, Hitler's regime seemed shielded by propaganda, terror, and real support from part of the population. Internal resistance was fragmented, disorganized, and often isolated. Even so, pockets of opposition appeared, some within the Wehrmacht and bureaucracy, others in religious and student circles. One of the best known is the White Rose Group, formed largely by students at the University of Munich, such as Hans and Sophie Scholl, Christoph Prost, and others. They didn't blow up tracks or set depots on fire. Instead, they wrote and distributed leaflets denouncing the regime's crimes and calling for moral resistance. That doesn't mean they were less brave than armed saboteurs. In a totalitarian state, leaving leaflets in university corridors, mailboxes, or on benches could be as deadly for the author as placing a bomb under a train. According to trial records, when they were captured and brought before Nazi justice, White Rose members were brutally interrogated and put through show trials, ending with execution by guillotine. Their direct impact on the Nazi war machine may have been limited, but their symbolic impact was huge. The White Rose showed that even in the heart of the regime, there were people trying to sabotage what it demanded most: silence. Every resistance has a cost. In occupied Europe, that cost was often measured in entire villages. When, in 1942, Czech agents trained by the SOE assassinated Reinhard Heydrich in Prague, one of the main architects of the final solution, the operation was considered a textbook blow by the resistance. But the Reich's response was so brutal that even some allies later questioned the human price of that action. In reprisal, the Nazis wiped out the village of Lidice. Men were shot, women and children deported, houses burned, the town literally erased from the map. In another settlement, Lejacky, the same terror. In France, after resistance actions, places like Oradour-sur-Glane appeared, where a Waffen SS unit massacred the population and burned the town in 1944. Its ruins were preserved after the war as a memorial, a frozen testimony to what resistance and Nazi brutality meant for civilians trapped in the storm. In Greece, villages such as Distamo were the scene of massacres in 1944 after partisan attacks. In Yugoslavia, Poland, and occupied Belarus, the pattern repeated, and many of those communities never became widely known outside their own countries. For saboteurs, this created an almost unbearable dilemma. Every explosion might come down on the heads of people who had nothing to do with the action. Even so, many chose to go on, not out of ignorance, but from a harsh perception. Nazi occupation was itself already a slow-motion death sentence for millions. Resistance, even with the risk of reprisals, seemed to them the only way to reclaim some control over their own fate. It is hard to measure exactly the numerical impact of sabotage in occupied Europe. Historians disagree on estimates, and many documents were lost or destroyed. But some points are relatively widely accepted. Resistance movements forced the Reich to keep large troop contingents tied down in internal security roles. Railway sabotage, especially in France, Yugoslavia, Greece, and Poland, delayed and complicated troop and supply movements. Attacks on factories and production lines hurt the war industry. Even if in a fragmented way, resistance networks provided crucial intelligence to the Allies, from coastal battery locations to details on divisions on the move. According to Allied records, the role of the French resistance around D-Day is a clear example. Coordinated sabotage of rail and communication lines before and during the invasion helped isolate the Normandy front from the rest of France, disrupting German reinforcements. In Yugoslavia, partisan activity reached such a scale that some German commanders later admitted the region was a black hole of resources, fuel, trains, entire units sucked into a war with no clear front line. In Norway, as we've seen, sabotage operations against heavy water and transport targets helped prevent the occupation from becoming a fully secure platform for strategic projects. And above all, across Europe, The resistance undermined what the Reich most needed to sustain such a long war on so many fronts: the feeling of total control. Behind abstract numbers, it is easy to forget that every act of sabotage had a face, a life, a story. Nancy Wake, born in New Zealand and raised in Australia, became one of the most famous agents linked to the French resistance. Working with the SOE, she helped organize sabotage, coordinate Maquis groups, and run escape routes. She had a huge bounty on her head in Gestapo files. Later she would say what she most hated about the Nazis was not just their brutality, but their cowardice towards civilians. We're told Pilecki, an officer of the Polish Armia Krajowa, did something almost unimaginable. He voluntarily infiltrated Auschwitz to organize internal resistance and send reports on what was happening there. Although his action involved more espionage than sabotage in the classic sense, his presence helped coordinate small forms of resistance inside one of the most guarded and lethal places in occupied Europe. Anonymous railway workers in countries like France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Poland, who made mistakes on purpose, delayed trains, tampered with coal loads, or passed timetables to underground groups. Many were never officially recognized. Some never even told their own children what they had done. The women of the resistance, who carried messages in bread baskets, weapons hidden in prams, explosives under their skirts. In many movements, they were responsible for communications and logistics, vital roles to make physical sabotage possible. Almost all of these people, in their post-war testimonies, showed a particular trait in common: an awareness that while they had sabotaged the Nazi machine, they had paid an internal price: nightmares, memories, guilt over those who did not survive. After the war, the silent saboteurs were treated very differently, depending on the country. In places like France and Yugoslavia, the resistance was elevated to the status of founding myth. The image of the resistant or partisan became the symbol of a nation that, even if defeated militarily, had never surrendered spiritually. Elsewhere, the story was more complicated. In Poland, for example, many members of the Armia Krajowa ended up persecuted by the new communist regime, which viewed any force not aligned with Moscow with suspicion. In some regions, conflicts between resistance groups of different ideologies carried on after the war, sometimes in the form of political violence. In the Netherlands, Belgium, and Norway, resistance was widely honored, but always side by side with another painful theme: collaboration. And sabotage by a few had only become necessary because many others, out of fear, opportunism, or conviction, had cooperated with the occupier. According to several memory studies, the following decades were marked by a kind of silent negotiation between heroism and trauma. In many cases, former resistance members themselves were reluctant to speak in detail about their actions. The Invisible War had also been emotionally devastating. When we think of the Second World War, it's easy to imagine tank factories, armored battles, bomber squadrons crossing the sky. Silent saboteurs rarely appear in those scenes, but somewhere behind the lines, there was always someone with a screwdriver in hand, a pair of pliers, an explosive wrapped in cloth, a radio hidden under the floorboards. It might be a railway worker quietly swapping bolts for slightly weaker ones, a young man deforming gear teeth in a factory making parts for German aircraft, a priest hiding a transmitter in the church basement, a student crossing the city with messages sewn into her coat lining. None of them won the war alone. None managed, in a single act, to bring down the Reich. But all of them contributed to the same goal: to weaken, day after day, the myth of German invincibility and the idea that occupied Europe was silent because it wasn't. On nights when trains derailed, bridges blew up, factories mysteriously caught fire, and documents vanished, Nazi occupation revealed its greatest flaw: it needed to appear absolute to survive, and these men and women showed with every act of sabotage that disappearance was a lie. In the end, the silent saboteurs left a legacy that goes beyond military technique. They proved that even in the face of the most brutal war machine Europe had ever seen, there was still room for refusal, ingenuity, and courage. That a railway missing a bolt, a civil registry in flames, or a bridge disappearing before dawn can weigh as much as a cannon shot, and that sometimes the loudest noise in history comes from gestures almost nobody sees.